My name is Mandy, and I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm half Korean, and I've been living in Korea for 10 years. I lived with my parents until I came to Korea. My dad is American, and my mom is Korean. They met in Korea, and my dad was in the Air Force. They were just barely 20, and my mom was just living in Osan, where the Air Force Base is. And my mom was working in one of the little shops. My dad couldn't speak Korean. My mom couldn't speak English. And so I always asked them, how did they fall in love? And they said, body language. So growing up in Tulsa, Oklahoma was your pretty typical American childhood. My dad, being white American, he's very expressive and very loving and always wants to give hugs and everything. And then my mom, she's kind of your typical Korean woman who's a little soft-spoken and a woman of little words, but very wise, and she's a very strong woman. She put me in Korean, Hangul Hakgyo Korean class at church because I was interested in it, but I was the only one. My siblings had no interest. So, but because I expressed interest, she always tried to find a way for me to learn. She was able to create a Korean community by attending church in Tulsa. Yes, there are Korean churches in Tulsa. There's actually about 5 of them, which I know is still not a lot, but my whole life I grew up in the Korean church and had lots of Korean friends. She did cook a lot of Korean food. My dad wasn't really able to eat Korean food every day. So sometimes, a lot of the times, my mom would cook 2 meals a night, where she'd cook 1 Korean meal and 1 non-Korean meal. It was kind of my dad's rule that everyone needs to be home for dinner at the same table and sitting together and talking and sharing a meal. So I have a lot of really good memories. My Korean community was my church, and I was literally raised since a baby in that same community. They accepted me really well. And my dad too, because my dad is, even though he's like 6'1" white guy with blue eyes, blonde hair, he was so friendly, and he really wanted my mom to have a Korean community. So he supported her, where he would go to church with her, even though he couldn't understand Korean. He would just sit there next to her so she could have that community. I have this really vivid memory of my dad sitting us down and telling us, hey, you guys are different, and that's cool. Being half was never considered negative in my family. It was always, my dad did a lot to make sure that it was a cool thing and that it was positive. I also did gravitate more towards my church friends, and they just happened to be all Korean. I think I did learn a lot about Korean culture from them, like watching a lot of shows with my friends and movies and listening to K-pop together. In college, I studied music, and I had the goal that I would move to Korea to pursue a career in K-pop music. Took a teaching job so I could get my foot in the door of Korea. And little did I know that teaching job would actually become my passion. And I really developed this even greater passion for teaching and for children than I had for music. So I kind of put music on the back burner just as a hobby, and teaching became my number 1 passion in life. A lot of them think I'm just white. So, and actually that's a benefit to the Hagwon, to the school, because they tend to want more white teachers, but they're excited when they hear that my mom is Korean and my dad is white, and they're always like, how it's really cute. When they find out that I'm half Korean, they feel more comfortable with me. I don't think anybody could have predicted that I would be here 10 years, even myself. Actually, I told my parents, give me 5 years in Korea, and if nothing happens, like with my job, or if nothing happens, like a relationship, if there's nothing keeping me there, I'll come back. And because my family's so tightly knit, I think it was hard on them that I left. But I met my husband here and we got married 3 years ago, so that definitely elongated my time in Korea. Having that experience of leaving my family and coming to a country where I actually don't have any family in Seoul, I feel like I understand my mom a lot better. But if you were to ask her now, America is her home. She comes to Korea and she feels really uncomfortable actually. I think she's more used to the quiet life in Oklahoma, and then when she comes to visit me in Seoul, it's a little too busy and too many people and loud. So it's quite funny how that's happened. The interesting thing that I've found is Korean culture is very different than Korean American culture. That has stood out a lot because all I knew about Korea before coming here was Korean American culture, which if you think about it, all the old, the emos and samchons living in America right now, they moved to America in like the 70s or the 80s. And if you look at Korea right now, it's much different than the 70s and the 80s. So I would actually say that Korean American culture could be a little bit more old school. It was very easy to feel American in America because I didn't have my mom's family in America. Every holiday was spent with my dad's family, so very typical white Christmas, and that's a two meaning there, white Christmas. But living in Korea now, I feel like definitely more in tune with my Korean culture, and I've had a lot of opportunities to spend time with my mom's family. I think being half Korean is a very vital part of my identity. I do know a lot of other half Koreans who struggled a lot. My personal experience is I don't feel like I had to go through as much struggle with my identity as a half Korean. And from an early age, I just accepted myself as perfectly half Korean. My parents would put us in like Korean dancing. They just did whatever they could to supplement the lack of Korean culture in the house. So I do think that Korean our culture in general is taught and can be learned. And I do think it is important for our future kids or for the future generation of Korean Americans to know their Korean heritage and their Korean culture and to make it their own in a way. To me, being half Korean is having kind of the best of two worlds where you can enjoy Korean culture and you can enjoy, for me, American culture. I think America will always be my home, but Korea has definitely become my second home. That's for sure. My name is Mandy. This is my Korean American story.